Broadcasting from occupied territories or the flea media, it's the Reality Dysfunction Podcast. A space where a diverse group of brown folk from across the nation explore the political experiences and social future of our Chicano Latino community. Control the narrative. Resist the dysfunction.
Hey everyone, this is Dr. Ernesto. I'm back again with another episode of the Reality Dysfunction. I'm very excited today to have with me Jose Oliva, who is the campaign director at Heal Food Alliance. Jose and I have known each other for a number of years now. We met through a mutual acquaintance who's actually been on the Reality Dysfunction a number of times, Dr. Teofilo Reyes. But today we're going to talk with Jose about the work that he's doing up there in Chicago and kick it around a little bit more about that whole Latino thing that seems to be coming down hard here in the United States. So, hey, Jose, it's good to have you here. Why don't you, introduce yourself?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Dr. Ernesto, aka Todd. How are you? It is absolutely a wild time, and I think just as an introduction, I'll tell your listeners that I am currently the campaigns director at the Heal Food Alliance. HEAL is an acronym that stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, and Labor. So we are a multi-sector, multi-racial, multi-generational alliance of organizations that functions at the national level to transform our food system, which, as many of your listeners might know, it is completely screwed up and has been screwed up for many, many years. I would venture to say that when this country was founded, and it was founded on the premises of slave labor, that's when the food system that we currently are reaping the benefits of was born. So our legacy in the food system is in slavery. Our legacy of this food system is also in the exploitation of natural resources from a very non-Indigenous, from a very Eurocentric perspective. So that's HEAL. I'm also the former co-director, co-founder of another alliance that's called the Food Chain Workers Alliance, which was a national coalition of food worker organizations that represents roughly 400,000 workers, farm workers, meat processing, food processing, transportation, warehousing, restaurant, and grocery store workers. So that's me. That's who I am, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here.
So the Food Chain Alliance, is that work that came out of the work that you did when you were at ROC, the Restaurant Opportunity Centers United?
Yeah. So a little bit of my background and my story. So I can go back to Guatemala. I was born and raised in Guatemala and grew up in the midst of the Civil War there that was actually triggered because of a CIA coup that took place in the 1950s that overthrew the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. And Jacobo Arbenz Guzman was attempting to redistribute land to landless peasants. And that redistribution program was actually run by my grandfather, Mario Gonzalez Orellana. And his work was essentially to map out all of the arable land in Guatemala and figure out how that land might be redistributed to folks who didn't have land. And what he found was that about 1/3 of all of the arable land in Guatemala was held by a foreign company, a US-based company that we today know as Chiquita Fruit Company. Back in the day, it was called the United Fruit Company. And they held about 1/3 of all of the arable land in Guatemala. And when my grandfather gave his report to the president of Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz, he said, well, we need to nationalize this land in order for us to redistribute it to folks that don't have land. And in doing so, he angered the CEO of Chiquita, whose name was John Foster Dulles. And his brother was Allen Dulles, and Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA. So it literally was a phone call from one brother to another saying, hey, they are taking our land, even though the Guatemalan government was actually paying Chiquita for the land. They were not taking it from them. They were paying them the market value of the land. But it was enough to trigger a CIA coup that overthrew the government of Jacobo Arbenz and established a military dictatorship that went on for over 60 years. And it triggered a civil war. And the civil war is why my family had to leave Guatemala in the first place. So we came here in 1985, landed in Miami, lived in Miami for about a year until we just couldn't take it anymore because there were a number of threats and other pretty vicious attempts against my parents because they were progressives and they were Guatemalan and they were dark skinned. They weren't light skinned anti-Castro Cubans. Yeah. And so we ended up having to leave Miami and come to Chicago in 86. And so ever since then, we've been here in Chicago. But once we were here, I wanted to go to college and I didn't realize that I was undocumented until I graduated high school. And I realized that I couldn't get any scholarships or Pell Grants or any of that. So I ended up working in the restaurant industry to pay my way for literally with tips that I would get in the restaurant. I would pay for my credit hours at the University of Illinois in Chicago. It was working in the restaurant industry that I realized that we basically have a fairly discriminatory employment system here in the US, right? Like you go to any restaurant and you'll see a stark difference in the way that front of the house people look versus back of the house people. And when I say look, I'm talking about race, right? Like front of the house folks tend to be white or lighter skinned folks. Back of the house folks tend to be immigrants and predominantly Black and indigenous people of color. And that got me started thinking about how do we organize in the restaurant industry. We organized the first worker center here in Chicago back in 2001 called the Chicago Interfaith Worker Center. That led me to connect with Saru Jayaraman and some of the other folks that started the Restaurant Opportunity Center of New York. And through ROC, so, instead of sort of reinventing the wheel here in Chicago, what we decided to do is to sort of partner up with ROC, and we created this national network of worker centers that was called ROC United, which is where Teofilo still to this day works. Yeah. And at ROC, right, when I was there, one of the things that we noticed was that there was this growing consumer awareness around food, where people would ask about food in ways that we hadn't seen before, right? Like, where was this chicken raised, right? Or is this produce organic, or that kind of thing. And that made it very clear that there was this new brand of consumer that was actually thinking about some of the qualities of the food. But not a lot of people were making the connection between the qualities of the food and the quality of the work that the workers who were picking, preparing, packing, transporting, and serving that food had, right? And so that's what led us, while we were at ROC, like it led us to realize that we needed to develop something that was bigger, that looked at the food system as a system, and that brought together the various sectors, not just of food workers, farm workers, processing workers, all of the whole supply chain, but also other organizations and even unorganized individuals who cared about food from those other angles, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's the story in a nutshell.
See, that's an incredible story. And I think that, it's like one of the very first things that you started talking about when you're talking about the legacy of food production, in the United States. And honestly, I mean, the minute you said that, I was just like, well, yeah, of course it's, it's rooted in slavery, right? Like we expect that. I mean, we expect that people who work the land, I mean, do it for very little. I mean, even to this day, right? And so that the idea though, and I understand what you're saying about this new type of consumer, people are, how is this chicken raised? Or, are these carrots organic and all of that? But there still is so little dialogue around working conditions, right? I mean, in some ways it does feel like people are more concerned about the chicken that they're going to eat than they are the people who are taking care of the chicken, And I say that as somebody who spent a day working on a chicken farm. It was a horrible day. I mean, it was, I was working with my dad in the summertime in Iowa, and he was a labor contractor. He used to bring people up from the Rio Grande Valley, and he would like farm them out to different farmers in Iowa. He did that for many, many years. He himself had been a migrant worker. We used to go there in the summertime and detassel corn. I'd go with these guys that I was in college with, and we'd be there for a couple of weeks, and we'd make pretty good money, a couple $1,000s, in 2 weeks, which in the late 80s was a considerable amount of cash. But yeah, one day we didn't have any corn to detassel, so he being the good labor contractor that he was, he still had work for us. So he took us to this gigantic barn, and he said, yeah, I got a surprise for you guys today. And those were his exact words. I got a surprise for you guys today. And when they rolled the doors open on that barn, the stench, it was like a solid wall of stench that just rolled out of that place. I swear to God, that barn was 1/4 mile long. And in the middle of it was just a giant wire cage. It's what it looked like, a giant wire cage. And then when you walked in, what you saw was that underneath was a giant wire cage that was made up of compartments. And in each side of those compartments, there turned out to be 20 little chickens inside each one of those compartments. And underneath it was this cement river of chicken pee and poop. Is where the smell came from. And our job that day was to reach into those cages that were over this river of piss and shit and count out 10 little chickens and then put them into another set of cages because the chickens were getting too big to all be in the cage together. That was horrible. It was horrible. I mean, it was horrible to see. And I've eaten a lot of chicken since then. I'm not going to try to pretend like I didn't or I haven't. But I mean, it was something to see. That was the first time that I ever faced the realities of factory farming. But, looking at the conditions that people were living in and stuff. I mean, it was just, it was incredible. But yeah, it makes sense. The legacy of slavery is right. What drives our food system today.
Yeah. So if you think about that experience, right, and multiply that by 100, right? Yeah. That is what we are living in today. Because back in the 80s, that was sort of an isolated situation. The industry that we know today depends on these KFOs, is what folks refer to them as, confined animal feeding operations, CAFO. That's what you're describing. That has multiplied tremendously in the course of the last 30, 40 years. And the impacts of that on climate, for one, right? Because what you're talking about is an intensification of greenhouse gases that are emitted in chicken plants, maybe not so much, but they also have that same model for pork and for beef.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about, millions of animals every day defecating, and those pools of methane that are gathered are impacting our environment, right, in ways that are pretty obvious to folks who live nearby, right? If you are unlucky enough to live near a KFO, you know exactly the impact that these operations have on the environment because you're living it directly.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you work in one of these places, you also you have that firsthand experience of what it's like. That impact isn't just there, right? The impact is actually handed down through the supply chain because we end up with a product, meat in particular, that is actually raised with a lot of antibiotics. The reason that antibiotics are critical to KFOs is because those animals are not meant to live so close together to each other, right? They're not meant to be packed into those small confined spaces, and they often develop infections and they often die as a result. So what the industry has done to deal with that is that they have pumped antibiotics into their feed, and they're eating those antibiotics so that they don't get sick. But then we eat the meat that is pumped with antibiotics, and then we develop resistance to those antibiotics. So then when we get an infection and we're given antibiotics, our bodies can't fight off the infection anymore because we've literally immunized ourselves against those antibiotics. Right?
That's
so
crazy.
It has impacts all around us, right? And that's the thing I think that people don't realize about how the structure of the food system is as destructive as it is to everybody and everything.
So, I mean, when we think about this and you think about how, really what we're doing is treating our food source as very disposable, right? Like there's no way it's going to end. It's like oil or it's like water. We're just going to keep using it and using it and using it until, it doesn't, because it, in our mind, it never runs out. But I think, specifically, for the Latino community, I mean, how do you see the crossover in terms of disposability? I mean, you've spent many years organizing workers.
Yeah. No, I mean, and it is a fundamental issue, right? In Guatemala, in my hometown of Xela, there are literal recruiters that work for Tyson or Smithfield or JBS who go around talking to people and recruiting them to come to the US to work for those companies. And so, if you are out of work in Guatemala, or even if you're in work, but you can imagine yourself making 14, 13, 12 bucks an hour in the United States, you're going to take that.
Yeah.
Especially if the company's offering to bring you here, right? And in an all expenses paid smuggling operation, which is essentially what they do, right? They smuggle people into the United States, take them to those plants, the processing plants across the US, and then they have employment when they arrive. And that happens in a couple of different ways, right? Either through legal H-2A programs, right? The agricultural programs, visas that are given through the USDA, and these companies apply to those visas, and then they bring people from Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, etc. Or they actually do it illegally as well, right? They pay smugglers, what are referred to as coyotes, right? They pay the coyotes bring people to the US, and then, there's a job waiting for them. In both of those situations, when people come to the US and they have that job waiting for them in that Smithfield plant in Missouri, they are then trapped in that job. The H-2A program is literally, you are beholden to that company. As long as you are working for that company, you are legally allowed to remain in the US. But the moment that company doesn't need you anymore, or the moment that you do something that sort of makes the company fire you, you're gone. And you're not just fired, you're gone back to your country, right? You're deported. And for undocumented workers that get smuggled into the country, it's even worse, right? Because you literally are in constant fear of being deported. And you're told, right? You're told by your supervisors and your managers that you shouldn't rock the boat. You shouldn't try to organize. You shouldn't try to do anything that asserts your rights, because that will alert the authorities, and you don't want the authorities to be alerted of your presence. And, folks don't recognize that in this country, there are some separations between, let's say, the Department of Labor and ICE, right? Immigration and Customs Enforcement, where you can file a Department of Labor complaint, and you're protected by the Department of Labor against ICE action. At least theoretically, you're protected. During the Trump years, that was gone, right? Like there was no real protection at all. And if you filed a complaint with DOL, you could easily be deported. Theoretically, we're back to a place where DOL will protect you if you file a complaint, as long as that investigation is ongoing from ICE action or from deportation in general. But yeah, so there's layers, right? There's that layer of sort of the fear of being deported and the fear of other legal action against you because you're undocumented, or if you're an H-2A worker, just being removed legally from the country. And then there's another layer, which is that in many of the plants where workers are coming to this country to work in, you end up working in a minority status. In other words, you are one small group of folks, right? If you're a Mexican, or if you're a Guatemalan, or if you're Honduran national, there's, a handful of others, or maybe, depending on the size of the plant, up to maybe, a dozen or so others from your national origin group. And then there's, hundreds of other folks, right? And one plant in Missouri in particular that we work with, a Smithfield plant, there's Ethiopian refugees, there are Eritrean refugees, there are Mexican immigrants, Guatemalan immigrants, there are folks from the Middle East, there are folks from Eastern Europe, and then there's native-born workers as well. And they're all mixed together, right? So there's at least seven groups of folks that are all mixed together. And there's a very open divide and conquer strategy by the employer, right? Yeah. Where they literally will tell some workers, look, these guys work harder than you, and they're just trying to make you look bad, right? Or these other guys, they're lazy. Like, why should you be putting up with that, right? Like, we should have more people like you working here, that kind of thing. And it creates resentment, and it creates division, even between, the quote unquote Latinos, right? Like that doesn't exist in national origin groups, right? Like, if I'm Guatemalan, I'm going to understand Mexicans and Hondurans, right? I'm going to understand what they're saying, but I don't really think of myself as one of them, right? I'm Guatemalan. I'm with my crew of Guatemalans. That's who my people are. And same thing with Mexicans, same thing with Hondurans, right? And so there's a larger sort of system at play in dividing and conquering people that actually prevents those folks from thinking of themselves as Latino or thinking of themselves as people of color, right? Like that's a whole nother layer of impediments, and both mentally and culturally for people from Latin America to think of themselves as people of color, right? Like, they oftentimes don't think of themselves that way, especially if you come from the dominant group in your country, right? If you're a Latino in Guatemala, Latino is a mixed race person like myself, right? Then you're not a person of color. You're just a regular Guatemalan, right? And then there's the Indians, Mayan people, who actually are the majority in Guatemala. They're more than 60% of the overall population, but they are a minority status group, even if they are the majority. It's similar to South Africa, right? And so you don't think of yourself as a person of color. They are the people of color. Mm-hmm. And it's shocking when you come to this country and suddenly you're a person of color. Yeah. Right? Like, it's a mind twist for a lot of folks.
So there is just a phenomenal amount of exploitation that's going on And I mean, the government, the United States government is clearly, I mean, they're barely trying to hide the fact that they're talking out of both sides of their mouth when it comes to immigration and it comes to work and all this other kind of stuff, particularly because of programs like H-2A, right? My question is, because this is also something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about over the last several years, is how much I hate to use the word documented, because like, I mean, so many of us, it's not even about being documented. I mean, I'm a citizen of the United States, right? My father was a citizen of the United States. All my kids are citizens of the United States. I mean, we're not documented. We were born here, you know? And so, but this is my point. My point isn't to make that distinction. My point is to say this. What can those of us who don't have any fear of being deported, right? How is it that we engage that critical mass of people? Because you're talking, you know, about 40, 50 million people who were born here, right? Who are citizens. And yet, you know, we see these abuses happening. And then it's even like the kids, you know, these poor children, you know, who are spending their childhood incarcerated, you know, in these prisons, and everybody's all like, oh, you know, Biden's going to let them out. I never thought for one second that Biden was going to let anybody out of jail. I don't think that dude in his entire career has let anybody out of jail, but he's put a lot of people in jail, you know? And so, but my question is, from an organizing standpoint, from a mobilizing standpoint, you know, what is it going to take to get the rest of these guys off their ass to do something? I mean, I think we could solve the immigration problem in the United States if we could even act in concert with each other a fraction. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's two answers to that question. That's a brilliant question, by the way. One of them, and I was starting to sort of hint at that in my last statement, what, you know, unification, right? Understanding us as a group of people that have common interests, because not just because we have a common ancestry or because we have common roots of the problems that we're facing, but because we identified a common solution, right? So just as an example, before the pandemic hit, there were 21.5 million people that were working in the food system. It was the largest private sector employer in the country by far, right? Bigger than healthcare. And of those 21.5 million, the vast majority were people of color. And we were people of color because not just people of color from Latin American descent or Caribbean descent, right? But we were people of color from all parts of the global South and from native communities here in the United States, right? And so the root causes that created the poverty in our communities are the same. It's disinvestment in those communities. It is a purposeful identification of those communities as the other, and then policies at the federal, state, and local level aimed at incarcerating and impoverishing those communities. Purposeful policies, right? Like, these are not accidental policies. These are policies that were set in place during slavery, post-slavery, and into modern day federal, state, and local. So to me, that is the critical first step, right? Identifying how we are all connected. What are some of the ways that we could act together? One clear way is understanding our community as a larger community of people of color, and understanding that we have these mutual self-interests and that we could act that on those self-interests, not just by voting for people who support those interests, right? I think there's it's sort of an old entire diatribe that we can vote people in and we can vote people out with our power. Yeah, great. That's good. But we should be the ones voting ourselves in, right? Like we should be the ones getting ourselves ready to take power by training ourselves, right? So at HEAL, we have this thing called the School of Political Leadership. The School of Political Leadership is intended to give people the skills that they need in order to run for office, right? And it's pretty basic and simple if you think about it in terms of I am rooted in my community and I'm going to be accountable to my community. But it's also an extremely difficult hill to climb because there's all of these impediments. There's all these obstacles that have been set up specifically to keep us from running for office, right? And so I think that's what we're trying to do at HEAL is get people prepared, get them ready, identifying those obstacles, removing those obstacles to the best that we can, right? There's obviously some obstacles that are so big that we're barely scratching at the surface right now. But I think that's one answer to your question. And I think the other answer to it is nothing happens. You know, it's the old adage of nothing happens without us organizing, without having power, right? And the power that we need to develop isn't just in the workplace. The power that we need to develop isn't just in a particular sector, in the community, for instance. The power is really across the board, right? And the only way that we're going to be able to develop that kind of power is if we are organizing, if we are investing in institutions that are organizing people, that are bringing people together around the common purposes. You know, one thing that I think gets me riled up is a lot of talk about organizing with no political vision, right? So organizing isn't just about bringing people together so that you can have cleaner streets, right? Or so that you can, you know, quote unquote, get rid of crime in your neighborhood.
Right.
That's not real organizing, right? Like you call that whatever you want to call it, but it's not organizing. Organizing means you have to have a vision, right? If you are bringing people together around the common issue in your community, fine, but that common issue shouldn't be the purpose you're organizing. It should be a vehicle to something bigger, right? And that something bigger is political vision that transforms society. That's not just about some, you know, tweaking around the edges, right? Reform this particular thing versus that other thing, right? It's really about transforming all of society. So
sometime in the last 30 years that shift happened. It happened gradually, but I face that with my students all the time, and I'm just like, what's your goal here, you know? And I mean, they're like, well, we just have to get together, and I'm like, that's not a goal. I'm like, we are literally all together right now in this room. And I tell them, I'm not trying to make fun of what you just said, but we are, you know, so I mean, that's right. You know, I mean, are we building organization? I agree with what you just said. I mean, I feel like if we're not building organization for some sort of a stated or understood political goal, and not implicitly understood, but explicitly understood, right? Then we're not engaged in organizing. We are engaged in, we're not even engaged in activism. I mean, that's neighborhood beautification. What's that?
I said it's club building.
It's club building. That's right. Yeah. We're the Latino club, you know, or we're the Chicano club, you know, and it's just like, or we're a car club. We build cars, you know. I mean, even they have more of a sense sometimes of what it is that they're doing. So yeah, that's interesting, man. I have these last several years just spent so much time thinking about it, you know, and just and really, you know, having that conversation with people and wondering where the pressure point is, because I don't believe that there aren't cleavages that could be exploited in terms of, you know, and I mean, for anyone that's listening, I'm talking, you know, nonviolent direct action, you know what I'm saying? But I just don't believe that there's not something that people could do, you know. But I know the problem seems so insurmountable because it's so huge, but there's so many of us that I think that it evens out, but the question is how do you mobilize, that many people?
No, that's right. That's right. And there's also, I again hinted at this earlier, right? But there are differences that are exploited by the other side that we need to overcome first, right? So these differentiations around national origin, around race, around language, around all of these critical components that, not to say that they're insignificant, but they are literally hurting us more than they are helping us, right?
Yeah.
And to the extent that we know that there's a common root cause to all of our mutual problems, and that we know that our liberation is bound together to each other, then we should be moving as one, right? But we're not, and we're not oftentimes because we let a whole myriad of differences get in the middle of our own self-interest of liberation. And that I think is the biggest thing to overcome. I do, say what you will about the current generation of activists and organizers that are coming out. I do notice that there is the pendulum is swinging in the right direction.
I think that's true also. Yeah.
Right. I see a lot more understanding of systems, right? A lot less focus on like minutia and specific issues, right? But understanding the systems that are underneath. I see a lot more understanding on transformation, less on transaction. And I also see a lot more understanding on sort of root causes versus the effects, right? Like the causes of the effect have not always been understood, right? But I do think that this generation has a handle on all three of those very critical components. And I haven't seen that in a long time. And I haven't seen that since we were kids.
Well, I think that's true. I do. And I think also just to build off what you said, I think that we are actually having a real conversation about colonialism and settler colonialism and decolonization in this country right now. And it may not be a viral conversation, but it is a conversation that is definitely taking place in our communities in a way. I mean, like back in the late 80s or 90s, when I was working for the farm workers, I think that's when I first met you, was like through Lori and Teofilo. When I would come over to Chicago, we would come over from Detroit, and we were working for the United Farm Workers. I mean, there was a knot of people who were talking about decolonization at that point, or settler colonialism. And it was a small group of people, but that conversation has expanded, dramatically. And I think you're right about especially the transformation part in terms of that. I mean, you can see it even in the way that people approach their sexuality or their gender. I mean, it's the transformation piece is definitely there, and it's I think a lot less transactional. Well, sometimes it's very much not transactional because people are just like,
Oh, that's right.
They're purposely not transactional. So, yeah. Wow. I think that's really interesting. Oh, this has been a good conversation, man. I really love talking to people because, it's just amazing sometimes, like when you hear people talk, how it like kicks things off in your head, and you're like, yeah, that's right. I never really thought about it that way. But yeah, that's good.
I'm glad I said at least one smart thing on your show.
You said a whole bunch of smart things, brother. So, hey, what's next? What's going on? What are your guys' big campaigns for the future?
Yeah. So we are currently working on a couple of big things. One of them we were calling the EWOC campaign, the Essential Workers Organizing Campaign. And it was centered around food workers during the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, we had massive unemployment, particularly in the restaurant industry. Our estimates was that over 70% of workers in the industry were unemployed. So there was a lot, and I'm sure Teofilo has talked a little bit about this, but there was a lot of effort around building these relief funds, like the one that Rock United put together and others. And then beginning around March or April of last year, there was a slew of wildcat strikes in the meatpacking sector.
Yep.
That then culminated in this executive order by Trump on April 27th that essentially forced everybody back to work. And, there's a lot of legal analysis around whether that executive order was even legal, but the impact that it had is undeniable. And that is that it really scared everyone, especially immigrant workers, right? It scared them enough to feel like, oh, we better go back to work, right? Otherwise, there's going to be some kind of executive action. And then that created the conditions for a lot of support from a lot of ally organizations. We helped organize over 200 big national food, environmental, health, other organizations that applied a lot of pressure to the companies, Tyson, Smithfield, all of the big meatpacking producers. We started talking to their investors, sort of telling them that they were basically at risk, right? That if workers began to die in those plants, that they could be held liable for those deaths.
Yeah.
And so we were pretty successful in getting all of the large meatpacking companies to implement a PPE policy, protective equipment policy for workers. We got them to create sick leave policies in a lot of places where they didn't exist before, cleanup policies, social distancing, that kind of thing. What we were not successful in doing is in getting them to slow down the lines, which is actually really what is critical in this moment, right? In poultry, for instance, we have a line speed that is ridiculous. It's 120 birds per minute. So if you can imagine, if you're working on a line in a poultry plant and your job is to work the wings, right? The wings of the chicken. That means you have to make 2 motions to cut one wing and then another from each bird.
Yeah.
And you have to do that motion 120 times every minute. So it is an insane
how's that
amount.
Possible? I mean, that doesn't seem like
it's possible. It's possible. You're just constantly cutting.
So
and the birds are stopping in front of you for less than a fraction of a second. It's insane. And that's the USDA regulation, right? That's what the regulation that the federal government has issued to poultry producers. Similar in pork, similar in beef. Obviously, those animals are a lot bigger, so it can't be that fast. But it's a similar, an equivalent line speed. And so a lot of our focus now on EWOC is really to get the emergency temporary standard that OSHA is about to put out to include line speed and to really look at the issue of line speed as something that is critical to the health and the well-being of workers, despite or beyond the vaccination rate, right? Like people might be vaccinated, fine, that's great. The rates might be down and the pandemic might be winding down, great. But if to the extent that we don't want the variants to become new viruses, we need to make sure that we have some protections that are set up in our food system so that doesn't actually propagate the creation of new variants of the coronavirus. Then there's another campaign that we're working on called the Real Meals campaign. In the Real Meals campaign, we're focused on Airmark, Sodexo, and Compass Group. Mm-hmm. And those are the 3 large food service providers that control over 60% of the entire food service market. They control over 80% of the higher education food service market. And so this campaign is largely driven by students in colleges and universities all over the country. And it's really about divesting their schools' money from these large corporations and going to a more self-operating model that actually is going to invest that money in their own regional food system and that prioritizes Black and Indigenous people of color businesses. And that's really a part of the campaign that has really taken root in campuses all over the U.S., has been this divesting from prison slave labor, because all three of these companies, and especially Aramark, invests heavily in prison slave labor, right? These are folks in prisons all over the country who are literally producing the food that is served in college cafeterias all over the country, right? So that's the other part of our work. And then the third thing, and this is also really exciting, is this emerging procurement work that we're calling Good Food Communities. There's a way for us to think about how we collectively are purchasing food in school districts and other public institutions all over the country. So for instance, here in Chicago, the Chicago Public Schools purchases about $300 million worth of food every year. That food had no criteria before Good Food Communities came on the scene. It was literally just, let's get the cheapest food we could find and put it on cafeterias for kids to eat all over the city. And what we did is we introduced a process for us to have 5 value categories around human health, environmental sustainability, animal welfare, local economies, and labor, of course, and that the school district has to consider all 5 of these whenever they are securing contracts with various vendors. And they don't get to pick and choose which one of the 5 they want to pick it, they want to excel in. They have to meet a baseline for all 5 of them, right? So in the labor value category, you have to, at the very least, be abiding by minimum wage, overtime, child labor, and employment discrimination, health and safety laws, at the very basic, right? At the very basic minimum. And I know that sounds like it's not much, but for those of you who have worked in the food system, you don't always make minimum wage, right? And you don't always have protections around discrimination and sexual harassment and things like that. So
that's right.
Anyway, so those are the 3 major campaigns that we're engaged in at the moment.
Okay. All right. Well, we're right about at our time. Man, this has been a great conversation. I'm hoping that, we can set up another time where we can get you and Teo and some other people back on here to really, have a kind of a
That'd
more,
I think a lot of fun.
A lot of fun, and and maybe a wider conversation too about, about food production and about organizing in general. I mean, these campaigns are amazing, and it's the work that you guys do up there is incredible. I'll say it really is. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Ernesto, and I really appreciate your work too, and you inviting me over to the podcast. This has been really great and a lot of fun for sure. And absolutely count on me for any future conversations. I'd love to be part of it.
All right, that'll be exciting.
This is The Reality Dysfunction.